Lecture 2, Ideologies and Isms. What is a political ideology? A political ideology upholds a vision on what is the best way for society to be governed. A few modern examples are democratic capitalism, authoritarian capitalism, democratic socialism, totalitarian socialism, and economic or social libertarianism. In this lecture, I will cover others as well. Each one of these ideologies proposes a set of core beliefs that determine the vision and concrete means to achieve this shared vision. Political visions and means. A political vision can also be described as the goals or ends of a political ideology. Understood in this way, a political ideology deals with the means to obtain certain ends. St. Augustine in The City of God distinguished between political means and ends in relationship to Rome, and through the city of Rome in relationship to all earthly forms of politics. According to St. Augustine, since the Romans had no other end than glory in this world, they chose vicious political means to obtain their political end. Interestingly, though, their vicious means appeared to be virtuous. For example, their desire for praises and honor produced the most virtuous appearing vices and propelled them to do great things. And in the transcript I provide two excerpts where St. Augustine describes the splendid vices of the Romans. With respect to peace, St. Augustine further distinguishes an earthly political end from a heavenly end. According to him, earthly peace differs from heavenly peace and can never be ultimately satisfying to human beings. This is because we are made for an end, heaven, that we cannot obtain in this world. Wars and conflicts arise on earth, argues Augustine, since on earth the goods we love cannot be shared by all. In heaven, however, the ultimate good of loving God can be participated by all without anyone being deprived. Ideologies and objectivity. Are all ideologies equally valid? Is there any objective or transcendent standard to judge the quality of an ideology? If so, what is this standard? Catholics believe that such a moral standard exists and is immutable and permanent throughout the variations of history. This moral standard is called natural law. As explained by St. Thomas Augustine, natural law refers to human beings' participation in eternal law. Eternal law refers to the providential and rational plan God has ordered creation by. As rational and social creatures, we, unlike non-rational animals, freely participate in God's plan and are not solely determined by instincts or chance. We freely cooperate in God's plan when we form social systems, including political ones, in accordance with natural moral law. What, though, is the content of natural law that by reason we can discover and follow? The 10 Commandments are at the core of natural law that all human beings can discover by reason in varying degrees according to their intellectual, emotional, and cultural limitations. To further aid human beings who, as a consequence of original sin, are weakened intellectually and emotionally, God revealed the 10 Commandments, known as the divine law of the Old Testament. The degree of political ideology is in accordance with natural law determines to what extent it encourages a just or an unjust system. The Catholic affirmation in our ability to conform our reason to natural moral laws is currently challenged by a modern concept. According to this concept, we might think we are bringing our minds into correspondence with the world, but actually what we are doing is bringing the world into correspondence with the categories of our mind. The German philosopher Immanuel Kant is well known for proposing this shift in thinking, which he called a Copernican Shift. According to Kant, it is impossible to know the world as it is. Instead, the purpose of our intellect is not to know the world and then to conform to it, whether morally or in a modern scientific way, but rather to form it according to the categories of our minds. This philosophical approach is contrary to the Catholic affirmation of reason's ability to discover both moral natural laws and laws of nature. This Catholic affirmation of reason's ability has profound political implications, since it upholds the existence of a universal moral standard called natural moral law that all human beings, when forming their political systems, are accountable to. Different types of ideologies and political leanings. Try correlating the following with either a conservative political view or a liberal political view, and then reflect and try to explain your answer. National defense, international military interventions, isolationist policy, military spending, deregulation of businesses, for example of carbon emissions, welfare, public assistance. Who is a liberal? The above exercise may have raised the following question: who is a liberal? To answer this question adequately, it is necessary to give a brief historical background of the term. The term comes from the Latin word liberalis, meaning liberty. One of the earliest uses of the term was during the medieval ages in reference to the curriculum of study at universities. The purpose of Catholic liberal arts education at a university, as Blessed Cardinal Newman wrote beautifully about in his Idea of the University, is primarily to educate students in knowledge that is free from practical ends, and has an end sufficient to rest in and to pursue for its own sake. Around the time Cardinal Newman lived, two new ideas of what it meant to be liberal gradually emerged. One was political liberalism. Those who proposed political liberalism, such as most grossly represented by the French Revolution begun in 1789, wanted to free themselves from absolute monarchies, which were supported by a political theory known as the divine rights of kings. In 1793, the liberal radicals of the French Revolution eventually took their theories to an excessive conclusion by unjustly cutting off the heads of their King Louis XVI and their Queen Marie Antoinette. A more moderate expression of political liberalism occurred during the American Revolution, when the colonists freed themselves from the rule of the British King George III. The other form of liberalism that emerged around the time of Cardinal Newman was economic liberalism. It was encouraged by the Industrial Revolution that first took place in England. A key proponent of economic liberalism was the Scotsman Adam Smith. In The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith proposed an economic system that is based on self-interest of an individual or group of individuals and not based on national interest or the interest of a monarch. In his earlier and complementary work, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, Smith refers to self-correcting mechanisms within human beings that prevent abuse of self-interest. These include an innate sense of empathy, which moves us to collaborate with others, and what Maria Pia Paganelli identifies as the self-interested desire to be praised as morally upright. These innate self-correcting mechanisms of self-interest, along with the external rewards and penalties of an economic market system, can properly direct the powerful drive of self-interest. Up until the end of the 1700s, economic activities and self-interest of explorers and merchants were moderated and directed by rulers, as usually kings, who only approved those ventures they believed would strengthen their state. Adam Smith wanted to sever this tie between rulers of states and business leaders. A current modern ideology that is based on Adam Smith's vision is called free market capitalism. It is also referred to as classical liberalism. Free market capitalism, classic liberalism, and economic liberalism, therefore, are basically equivalent terms. An essential underlying principle of economic liberalism is the belief that if a king or nation-state ensures competitors compete fairly in an economic market and then leave the economic market alone, it will adjust itself. Why? According to Adam Smith, this is because the economic marketplace is ruled by a self-regulating mechanism called the invisible hand. And I include excerpts from The Wealth of Nations. He also refers to the invisible hands not only in The Wealth of Nations, but also in The Theory of Moral Sentiments. What do you think he meant by the invisible hand? Remember how he thought self-interest can be directed. The English David Ricardo was an extreme proponent of economic liberalism proposed by Adam Smith. In his Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, Ricardo sets forth laws that supposedly govern economic interaction, such as the well-known one of supply and demand. The well-known theory of the iron law of wages is attributed to him, although it is uncertain to what extent he had adhered to this notion. According to this theoretical law, wages naturally tend to a level where workers are just barely able to survive and only can feed a few children. If wages are increased, the workers will be able to not only feed themselves, but also more of their children. The more children who live and do not starve to death, though, means there will be a greater supply of laborers for the same amount of jobs. As the supply of jobs increases and the demand for these jobs decreases, wages will naturally tend to a level where workers are just barely able to survive while not being able to feed their children. Intervention, according to this theory, does more harm than good. What is wrong with this theory? Does it assume the number of available jobs will remain constant from one generation to the next? Is this a correct assumption? The unjust treatment of workers, especially of helpless children, led to a spate of criticism of economic liberalism. One notable critic was the English writer Charles Dickens, who depicted the harsh realities of a newly industrialized England in his novels. Another critic from Germany was the political philosopher Karl Marx, who promoted communism as an eventual replacement of free market capitalism. As Karl Marx was composing his theory, England began to form another type of liberalism known as social liberalism. Under the political leadership of these new liberals, the foundation of a social safety net of health insurance, unemployment insurance, and pensions was established in the early 1900s. Social liberalism took a little longer to emerge in the United States. The president who promoted social liberalism was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was president for 12 years from 1933 to 1945. He believed the Great Depression, begun in 1929, was caused by an unregulated economic liberalism that, consequently, is prone to swing rapidly between economic booms and economic busts. FDR's program, called the New Deal, helped to define U.S. social liberalism. His program was supported by the economic theories of the British man John Maynard Keynes. Keynes opposed a completely free economic market. Instead, Keynes recommended that the state needs to regulate and to intervene in the economic marketplace. Sometimes this means that the state will prime the pump by injecting funds into the marketplace to stimulate the economy and to boost industrial production. The money used by the state to stimulate the economy need not necessarily be raised from new taxes, but could be gained by borrowing money. Governments perform the latter by issuing treasury bills, treasury notes, and treasury bonds, with the promise that the buyer of these various governmental bonds will receive back their money with interest. Some argue that deficit spending and priming the pump leads to inflation. Do you see how this can happen? Besides regulating the marketplace and intervening when he saw fit, FDR also was concerned with creating a social safety net. One of his programs that is still with us today is Social Security, begun by the Social Security Act signed on August 14, 1935. Lyndon Baines Johnson is another notable U.S. president, ruled from 1963 to 1969, and Johnson promoted a U.S. form of social liberalism, similar to FDR's. LBJ was responsible for advancing a project called the Great Society. A primary goal of the Great Society was to reduce poverty. Some of the programs that originated out of the Great Society project was Medicare, which provides health care to the elderly, and Medicaid, which provides health care to those on governmental welfare. Political isms. Can you name a political ism? I'm sure you can. Here are just a few: anarchism, libertarianism, capitalism, socialism, and communism. In this section, these various forms of political ideology, often identifiable with the ism tacked on at the end, will be defined. Note well, that these various forms of political ideologies often overlap one another. Anarchism. The English word anarchism comes from the Greek language and literally means without order or without origin. Anarchism, therefore, is opposed to government, since governments are an ordering principle and give their citizens a sense of origin traceable back to their government. A famous anarchist, who also has been categorized as a French libertarian socialist, was Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. Proudhon opposed private property. According to him, private property is theft. This is the slogan of 1893. This is the rallying cry of revolution. In place of private property, he advocated workers' associations, cooperatives, and encouraged the nationalization of land and workplaces. In What is Property, he argued the following, and I quote, "If I were asked to answer the following question, what is slavery, and I should answer in one word, it is murder, my meaning would be understood at once. No extended argument would be required. Why then to this other question, what is property? May I not likewise answer, it is robbery, without the certainty of being misunderstood, the second proposition being no other than a transformation of the first." End of quote. Why is Proudhon called both an anarchist and a libertarian socialist? Don't the two seem to be contradictory political ideologies? Not necessarily, if we imagine political ideologies to be like colors on a painter's palette. When we see political ideologies in this manner, then it is understood more clearly how it is possible to combine various forms of ideologies with one another. Proudhon is an anarchist since he opposed private property. He is a libertarian since he opposed state ownership of the means of production. Finally, he's called a socialist since he advocated that workers own the means of production. Is Proudhon theft? Is Proudhon right that property is theft? In his 1891 encyclical Rerum Novarum, Pope Leo XIII, a contemporary of Proudhon, answered this question with reference to St. Thomas Aquinas. And he stated this, that the government should at its option intrude into and exercise intimate control over the family and the household is a great and pernicious error. It is lawful, says St. Thomas Aquinas, for man to hold private property, and it is also necessary for the carrying on of human existence. But if the question be asked, how must one's possessions be used, the Church replies without hesitation in the words of the same holy doctor, man should not consider his material possessions as his own, but as common to all, so as to share them without hesitation when others are in need. Whence the apostle with, command the rich of this world to offer without stint, to apportion largely. True, no one is commanded to distribute to others that which is required for his own needs and those of his household, nor even to give away what is reasonably required to keep up becomingly his condition in life, for no one ought to live other than becomingly. If a workman's wages be sufficient to enable him comfortably to support himself, his wife, and his children, he will find it easy, if he be a sensible man, to practice thrift, and he will not fail by cutting down expenses to put by some little savings and thus secure a modest source of income. End of quote. Libertarianism. Libertarianism, coming from a Latin word meaning liberty, is an ideology that is opposed to a strong government, but, unlike a strict form of anarchism, maintains that a limited form of government is still necessary to protect citizens from one another and from outside aggression. There are many types of libertarianism. Some emphasize social liberty, such as the legalization of drugs and the elimination of some safety laws. Others emphasize economic liberty. According to economic libertarianism, unbridled capitalism is a good thing. In accordance with this thought, the noted libertarian John Stossel asserts, greed is good. Can greed ever be good? It is, after all, one of the 7 deadly sins. Capitalism. The term capitalism originates from the Latin word caput, which means head, such as the head of cow. Unlike a house or land, someone who owns cows can move them at will. Capitalism, therefore, is based on property that can be easily moved around. Currently, the moving capital of capitalism are not only heads of cows, but also include financial funds, stocks, and similar easily movable financial assets. In capitalism, businesses are primarily motivated by self-interest, which is expressed by competing with other businesses to make the most profit. Often in the U.S., capitalism is seen as necessarily coupled with the political system of democracy. But capitalism can also be joined with an authoritarian system of government. One possible example is China, which may be categorized as an authoritarian capitalism. This is implied in its constitution, revised under Deng Xiaoping, which identified China as a, and I quote, socialist market economy. The famous early U.S. capitalist John D. Rockefeller, who built up his Standard Oil Company by beating out his competitors, described his concept of business as follows, and I quote, "The growth of a large business is merely a survival of the fittest. The American beauty rose can be produced in the splendor and fragrance which brings cheer to its beholder only by sacrificing the early buds which grow up around it. This is not an evil tendency in business. It is merely the working out of a law of nature and a law of God." End of quote. The British philosopher and scientist Herbert Spencer, and contemporary of John D. Rockefeller, shared Rockefeller's capitalistic vision, but even more radically. He has been classified as a social Darwinist. And in describing his social Darwinism, he wrote, and I quote, "The poverty of the incapable, the distresses that come upon the imprudent, the starvation of the idle, and those shouldering aside of the weak by the strong, which leave so many in shallows and misery, are in fact the decrees of a far-seeing benevolence. It seems hard, unfair, that an unskillfulness, which with all his efforts he cannot overcome, should entail hunger upon the craftsman. It seems hard that a laborer incapacitated by sickness from competing with his stronger fellows should have to bear the resulting privations. It seems hard that widows and orphans should be left to struggle for life or death. Nevertheless, when regarded not separately, but in connection with the interests of universal humanity, these harsh fatalities are seen to be full of the highest beneficence, the same beneficence which brings to early graves the children of diseased parents and singles out the low-spirited, the intemperate, and the debilitated as victims of epidemic. Thus, by survival of the fittest, the militant type of society becomes characterized by profound confidence in the governing power, joined with a loyalty causing submission to all in all matters whatever. Submission to it in all matters whatever. End of quote. Spencer vigorously opposed social liberalism. He viewed it as necessarily involving slavery. In imposing social liberalism and socialism, Spencer argued the following: "But why is this charge described as the coming slavery? Is a question which many will still ask. The reply is simple. All socialism involves slavery. What is essential to the idea of a slave? The essential question is, how much is he compelled to labor for other benefit than his own? And how much can he labor for his own benefit? The degree of his slavery varies according to the ratio between that which he is forced to yield up and that which he is allowed to retain. And it matters not whether his master is a single person or a society. If without option he has to labor for the society and receives from the general stock such portion as the society awards him, he becomes a slave to the society. Socialistic arrangements necessitate an enslavement of this kind, and towards such an enslavement many recent measures, and still more the measures advocated, are carrying us. Let us observe first their proximate effects and then their ultimate effects." End of quote. Early socialisms and communism. Socialism stresses the reality that human beings are social creatures over individualism and private property. Some argue that socialists err by overemphasizing our social nature to the detriment of our natural right to private property. The earliest modern socialists came from England and France. In reaction to the abuse of workers during the Industrial Revolution, they proposed a variety of political alternatives to capitalism. I will briefly describe a few key early socialists from France and England. These early socialists all were criticized by later socialists as idealists who had great social visions but lacked a method in advancing their ideals. Count Henri de Saint-Simon, lived from 1760 and died in 1825. Saint-Simon was a French aristocrat who proposed a top-down socialist approach. He wanted the French state to be directed by a national board of technocrats. These technocrats were to consist of scientists, engineers, industrialists, and other similarly scientifically educated people. For further information, see his work or read it, The New Christianity. Francois Marie Charles Fourier lived from 772 to 1837. He was a French philosopher who, in contrast with Saint-Simon, advocated the decentralization of the economy. For this to occur, he proposed the creation of many small, centralized communities, which would include a manufacturing plan, living quarters, schools, markets, healthcare, and farms. Robert Owen lived from 1771 to 1858. This Welshman owned a cotton mill in New Lanark, Scotland. There he established a socialist factory and community. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Marx and Engels called the socialists mentioned above utopian socialists, since they argued these socialists had a dream but lacked concrete means to bring about their dream in an international manner. Marx and Engels, therefore, proposed a supposedly scientific socialism applicable for all to follow. To advance socialism in a scientific way, Marx wanted both workers and intellectuals to be educated in the so-called inevitable trends of history. Once educated, they would then know how to promote the progressive movements within history. Marx built on Hegel's dialectical concept of history, but for Marx, ideas are not the prime forces of history. Instead, the mode of production is. In Marx's material dialectic, opposing forces arise as technology changes. Up until communism, each mode of production entails class struggle, social revolution, and upheaval. The political stages, according to Marx, are feudalism, capitalism, dictatorship of the proletariat, democratic socialism, and finally pure classless, stateless communism where the state withers away. Since this movement in history is inevitable, claimed Marx, it is scientific. States prior to the last stage of communism are necessarily suppressive of communism. Due to the repressive features, class conflict develops in these suppressive political stages in order to overthrow the oppressive ruling class. The transition from one stage of history to the next can be relatively peaceful or violent. Modern socialisms and communism. Currently, there are many types of socialism, including authoritarian socialism, such as in the former USSR, democratic socialism, the socialist-influenced social democrats, many of whom reject the public ownership of the means of production, socialist market economy. China can be considered this since the state basically organizes the corporations but allows the market to determine prices. Libertarian socialism. Religious socialism. The British Anglican theologian John Milbank is an example of a religious socialist. Islamic socialists, eco-socialism, and the list goes on. There are also a variety of competing forms of communism. A few main ones are Marxist-Leninism, Maoism, and Trotskyism. Marxist-Leninism is Marxism as interpreted by Lenin, who advocated a hard form of socialism, unafraid of using violence in promoting the coming of communism. Maoism was found by Mao Zedong from China. Unlike Marxist-Leninism, Marxist-Maoism identifies the Chinese peasants and not factory workers as the vanguard of the revolution. Like Lenin, Maoism advocates the use of violent means in accordance with Mao's famous quote, "Political power comes from the barrel of a gun." Trotskyism owes its origin to Leon Trotsky. In 1940, Stalin successfully ordered Trotsky's assassination in Mexico. Unlike Lenin, Stalin, or Mao, Trotsky at least claimed he advocated a permanent revolution that some have interpreted as stressing peaceful means over armed struggle. God bless.